The Broken Spoke Ranch had been operating in eastern Wyoming since 1947. 32,000 acres of high plains grassland, rolling hills, and scattered ponderosa pine. The ranch ran about 800 head of cattle and had been in the Caldwell family for 3 generations. In the spring of 2024, the current owner, a man named Ray Caldwell, made a decision to drain the old stock pond on the northwest section. The pond had been dug in 1978 by Ray's father using a dragline excavator. It was fed by spring runoff and had served as a watering hole for cattle for over 40 years. But by the 2010s, the water quality had deteriorated. Algae blooms in the summer, mineral buildup. The cattle preferred other water sources. The pond sat mostly unused. Ray decided to fill it in and reclaim the land for pasture. He hired a local excavation company out of Gillette. The crew arrived in early May with a dragline, 2 bulldozers, and a fleet of dump trucks. The plan was to drain the pond, pull out the mud and sediment, backfill it with clean soil, and grade it level. Simple job, 2 weeks of work. The crew started on a Monday. The pond was 18 feet deep at the center. The dragline operator, a man named Hollis, started at the shallow end and worked his way deeper. The first few days were routine: mud, silt, decades of accumulated organic matter. They loaded it into trucks and hauled it to a spoil site on the far side of the ranch. By Thursday, Hollis was working the deepest section. The bucket came up heavy. He swung it over and dumped it. Something metal clanged against the side of the truck bed. Hollis stopped. He climbed down from the dragline and walked over to look. Sticking out of the mud was a piece of red-painted metal, corroded, covered in sediment, but clearly machinery. Hollis called over the foreman, a man named Eddie. Eddie looked at it and said it was probably an old implement. Farmers dumped junk in ponds sometimes, old equipment, scrap metal, stuff they didn't want to haul to a landfill. Eddie told Hollis to dig around it and see what it was. Maybe they could pull it out in one piece. Hollis went back to the dragline. He repositioned and started pulling mud away from the metal object. After an hour, the shape became clear. It was a tractor, buried upright in the mud at the bottom of the pond. Hollis could see the hood, the front grille, the loader arms extending forward. The whole machine was submerged and packed in sediment. Eddie called Ray Caldwell. Ray drove out to the site. He stood at the edge of the drained pond and looked at the tractor emerging from the mud. He didn't recognize it. It wasn't one of his family's machines. Ray's father had kept meticulous records of every piece of equipment they had ever owned, and none of them had ended up in this pond. Ray told Eddie to keep digging. He wanted to see the whole thing. Maybe it would tell them how it got there. It took the rest of the day and most of Friday morning to excavate the tractor. Hollis worked carefully, pulling mud away in sections, exposing the machine inch by inch. By noon on Friday, the tractor was fully visible. It was a Massey Ferguson 240, a utility tractor from the 1970s or early 1980s. The cab was missing, just an open operator station with a roll bar. The paint was mostly gone, eaten away by decades underwater. The tires had rotted off the rims, but the frame was intact. The engine was still bolted in place, and the front-end loader was still attached. Hollis swung the dragline bucket down and hooked a chain around the tractor's frame. He lifted. The machine came up slowly, mud and water pouring off it, 40 years of sediment sliding away. Eddie guided it over solid ground. Hollis set it down. The crew gathered around to look. That was when they saw the body. It was strapped to the front loader bucket. Chains and barbed wire wrapped around the skeleton, binding it to the steel frame of the bucket. The remains were still clothed. Denim and leather, rotted but recognizable. Boots still on the feet. A belt buckle glinting through the mud. And the skull, tilted forward, empty eye sockets staring at the ground. Eddie stepped back. One of the younger crew members turned and vomited. Hollis shut down the dragline and climbed down. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Ray pulled out his phone and called the sheriff. The Campbell County Sheriff's Department arrived within an hour. 2 deputies, then a detective, then the county coroner. They cordoned off the area with yellow tape. They photographed the tractor from every angle. They photographed the body. The coroner, a woman named Dr. Brennan, examined the remains in place. She said the body had been there as long as the tractor had, decades. The skeleton was fully articulated, still held together by the chains and wire. No soft tissue remained, no clothing except the most durable materials. Dr. Brennan said the person had been dead a long time, probably since the tractor went into the pond, and the tractor had gone into the pond deliberately. She pointed at the loader bucket. The body had been chained to it before the tractor entered the water. This wasn't an accident. This was a homicide, and the pond had been the grave. The sheriff's detective, a man named Lamar, asked Ray Caldwell when the pond had been dug. Ray said 1978. Lamar asked if Ray's father had ever mentioned anything unusual about the pond. Ray said no. Lamar asked if there were any missing persons cases from the late 1970s or early 1980s connected to the ranch or the area. Ray said he didn't know. He had been a kid in the 1980s. He didn't remember much. Lamar said they would check the records. Dr. Brennan said she would transport the remains to the state crime lab in Cheyenne for analysis. Dental records, DNA if possible, cause of death. Lamar said he wanted the tractor transported as well. It was evidence. The excavation crew helped load the Massey Ferguson onto a flatbed truck. The body was removed carefully, still in the chains, still wrapped in wire, and placed in a body bag. The coroner's van drove away. The flatbed followed, and the crew stood at the edge of the drained pond, staring at the hole in the mud where the tractor had been, and tried to process what they had just found. The investigation moved quickly. Dr. Brennan identified the body within a week. The dental records matched a man named Vincent Voss. Voss had been 43 years old when he disappeared in June 1983. He had lived in Gillette and owned a small construction business. He had been reported missing by his wife on June 14, 1983. The police had investigated. No evidence of foul play, no witnesses, no leads. Voss had last been seen leaving a bar in downtown Gillette around 11 p.m. on June 13th. After that, nothing. The case had gone cold. Voss was presumed dead, but his body had never been found. And 41 years later, at the bottom of a stock pond on the Broken Spoke Ranch, Lamar pulled the original missing persons file. He read through the reports. Voss had been in financial trouble in 1983. His construction business was failing. He owed money to several creditors. Some of the creditors were not the kind of people you wanted to owe money to. There were notes in the file suggesting Voss may have been involved in side dealings, drugs, gambling. The detectives in 1983 had suspected Voss had either skipped town to avoid his debts or had been killed by someone he owed. But without a body, they couldn't prove anything. Now they had a body, and they had a crime scene. Lamar contacted the state crime lab. He asked for a full forensic workup, cause of death, time of death, any evidence on the remains or the tractor that might identify the killer. The crime lab report came back 3 weeks later. Vincent Voss had died of blunt force trauma to the head. The skull showed a depressed fracture on the left parietal bone, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The blow had likely been fatal or near fatal. Voss had either been dead or unconscious when he was chained to the loader bucket. The chains and barbed wire had been applied post-mortem. Voss had been secured to the tractor after he was killed. The tractor had then been driven into the pond. The lab estimated Voss had been underwater for approximately 40 to 42 years, consistent with the 1983 disappearance. The lab also found trace evidence on the tractor: paint transfer on the loader bucket, fibers in the cab area, and a partial fingerprint on the steering wheel, preserved by the anaerobic conditions at the bottom of the pond. Lamar ran the fingerprint. It came back with a match. The print belonged to a man named Carl Eugene Draper. Draper had a criminal record: assault, theft, possession with intent to distribute. He had done time in the Wyoming State Penitentiary in the 1970s. And in 1983, Carl Draper had been employed as a ranch hand on the Broken Spoke Ranch. He had worked for Ray Caldwell's father. Lamar felt the case click into place. He pulled employment records from the ranch. Carl Draper had been hired in March 1983. He had worked through the summer. And he had quit abruptly in late June 1983, just days after Vincent Voss disappeared. Ray's father had noted in the payroll ledger that Draper had left without notice and without collecting his final paycheck. Lamar called Ray. He asked if Ray remembered Carl Draper. Ray said vaguely. He said Draper had been one of several hands who came and went during the 1980s. Ray had been a teenager at the time. He didn't remember much about the man. Lamar asked if Ray's father had ever mentioned anything unusual about Draper. Ray said no. Lamar dug deeper. He found that Carl Draper had known Vincent Voss. They had both been regulars at the same bar in Gillette in the early 1980s. The Silver Spur. A rough place. Fights were common. Drugs were available. Draper and Voss had been seen together multiple times. One witness, still alive and interviewed by Lamar, remembered that Voss had loaned Draper money in early 1983. $5,000. Voss had been trying to collect in the weeks before he disappeared. Draper had been avoiding him. The witness said there had been tension, arguments, threats, and then Voss disappeared. And a few days later, Draper quit his job at the Broken Spoke and left Wyoming. Nobody knew where he went. Until now. Lamar ran Carl Draper's name through national databases. Draper had moved to Montana in 1984. He had worked various jobs, logging, construction, ranch work. He had stayed out of trouble for the most part, a few minor offenses, but nothing serious. And in 1998, Carl Draper had died. Heart attack. He was 56 years old. He was buried in a small cemetery outside of Missoula. Lamar felt the case deflate. The killer was dead. There would be no arrest. No trial, no justice in the traditional sense. But there were answers. And Lamar kept digging because the Voss family deserved to know the full story. Lamar went back to the Broken Spoke Ranch. He walked the property with Ray. He asked to see the stock pond again. Ray drove him out in a side-by-side. The pond was still drained. The excavation was complete. The bottom was exposed. Raw dirt and clay. Lamar stood at the edge and looked at the depression where the tractor had been pulled from. He asked Ray if his father had been involved in the pond's construction in 1978. Ray said yes. His father had hired a contractor with a dragline to dig it. The contractor had excavated down to 18 feet, hit a gravel layer, and stopped. The pond had filled naturally over that first winter. Lamar asked if Ray's father had ever mentioned the pond being used for anything unusual. Ray said no. Just cattle watering. Lamar nodded. He was building a timeline. The pond was dug in 1978. It filled with water. It was used for 5 years. And then, in June 1983, Carl Draper killed Vincent Voss, drove the Massey Ferguson 240 with Voss's body chained to the loader into the pond, and let it sink. The pond was deep, 18 feet. The water was murky. Algae blooms started in the mid-1980s, making visibility near zero. Nobody would have seen the tractor at the bottom. Nobody would have looked. It was just a stock pond. Cattle drank from it. Cowboys rode past it. And underneath, 40 feet from the shore, a dead man sat chained to a tractor, waiting. Lamar interviewed Ray's mother. She was 81 years old and still sharp. She remembered Carl Draper. She said he had been a quiet man, a loner. He had lived in a bunkhouse on the ranch. He did his work and kept to himself. She said she hadn't trusted him. There was something off about him. She told her husband that, but her husband needed hands, and Draper was a good worker. When Draper quit suddenly in late June 1983, she had been relieved. She said she never saw him again. Lamar asked if she remembered the Massey Ferguson 240. She said no. She didn't keep track of equipment. That was her husband's domain. Lamar asked if her husband had ever mentioned losing a tractor. She said no. Lamar found that interesting. A tractor had gone into the pond in June 1983 and nobody had noticed. Or if they had noticed, nobody had said anything. Lamar pulled equipment records from the ranch. Ray's father had kept detailed logs, every tractor, every implement, purchase dates, maintenance records, disposal dates. Lamar found the Massey Ferguson 240. It had been purchased used in 1979 from a dealer in Casper. It had been used for light utility work, mowing, loader work, fence repair, and in June 1983 it had been marked as lost, stolen. There was a note in the ledger, MF 240 missing as of 6/18/83. Reported to sheriff, no recovery. Lamar felt a chill. Ray's father had reported the tractor stolen. He had filed a report. Lamar pulled the sheriff's records from 1983. He found the report. Gerald Caldwell, Ray's father, had reported the Massey Ferguson 240 stolen from the ranch on June 18, 1983, 5 days after Vincent Voss disappeared. The deputies had taken the report. They had looked around. No evidence, no suspects. The case went nowhere. The tractor was never recovered because it was at the bottom of the stock pond. And Carl Draper, who had access to the ranch equipment, had put it there. Lamar built a theory. On the night of June 13, 1983, Carl Draper met Vincent Voss, probably near the Silver Spur Bar in Gillette. Voss was pressing Draper for the $5,000. Draper didn't have it. An argument ensued. Draper killed Voss. Blunt force trauma to the head. Draper panicked. He had a body. He needed to get rid of it. He was a ranch hand. He had access to equipment. He drove back to the Broken Spoke Ranch. He loaded Voss's body into a truck. He went to the equipment yard. He took the Massey Ferguson 240. He drove it to the stock pond. He chained Voss's body to the front loader bucket. He drove the tractor into the pond. The tractor sank. Draper swam out. He walked back to the ranch. He cleaned up. And 5 days later, when the tractor was noticed as missing, he quit. He left Wyoming. He never came back. Lamar presented his findings to the Campbell County attorney. The attorney reviewed the evidence, forensics, fingerprints, timelines, witness statements. The attorney said the case was solid. If Carl Draper were alive, they could prosecute. But Draper had been dead since 1998. The case would be closed as solved but unprosecuted due to the death of the suspect. Lamar contacted Vincent Voss's family. Voss's wife had died in 2007, but Voss had a daughter. Her name was Laura. She was 56 years old and lived in Colorado. Lamar called her. He explained what they had found. He told her how her father had died. He told her who had killed him. Laura cried on the phone. She said she had been 11 years old when her father disappeared. She had spent her entire life wondering what happened. Now she knew. She asked if her father had suffered. Lamar said the forensics suggested the head trauma had been fatal or near fatal. Voss had likely been unconscious or dead when he went into the water. Laura said that was something. She asked what would happen to the body. Lamar said the remains would be released to the family for burial. Laura said she would bring her father home. The Massey Ferguson 240 stayed in the sheriff's evidence lot for 3 months. After the case was officially closed, Lamar asked Ray Caldwell what he wanted to do with it. Ray said he didn't want it. It was evidence of a murder. It had carried a dead man into a pond. Ray wanted nothing to do with it. Lamar said the county would dispose of it. The tractor was hauled to a scrapyard in Gillette. It was crushed and recycled. The metal was melted down. The Massey Ferguson 240, which had spent 41 years at the bottom of a pond with a man chained to its loader, ceased to exist. But the story didn't. Lamar wrote a final report. He included everything: the forensics, the timeline, the suspect, the victim. He filed it with the state archives, and he made sure the Voss family got a copy. Because even though justice couldn't be served in court, the truth had been found. And sometimes, the truth is the only justice families get. Ray Caldwell finished filling in the pond. The excavation crew completed the work in late summer. The area was graded level and seeded with grass. By the following spring, you couldn't tell there had ever been a pond there. Just pasture. Cattle grazed over it. The land moved on. But Ray couldn't. He thought about the pond every time he drove past that section. He thought about the tractor at the bottom. He thought about Vincent Voss chained to the loader. He thought about Carl Draper driving that machine into the water and swimming away. And he thought about his father. Gerald Caldwell had died in 2011. He had never known what was in the pond. He had never known that the missing tractor had been 50 yards from the ranch headquarters the entire time. Ray wondered if his father had suspected, if he had seen something, if Carl Draper had acted strange that week in June 1983. But his father had never said anything, and now he never would. Laura Voss buried her father in October 2024. A small service, just family. Vincent Voss's remains were laid to rest in a cemetery in Gillette, not far from where he had disappeared 41 years earlier. Laura placed a headstone. It read, Vincent James Voss, 1940-1983, found, remembered, home. Laura stood at the grave and thought about the tractor at the bottom of the pond. She thought about the chains and the barbed wire. She thought about the man who had killed her father and lived another 15 years without consequences. and she thought about the fact that her father's body had been underwater for longer than she had been alive. 41 years. Submerged. Hidden. Forgotten by everyone except the man who put him there. And that man had taken the secret to his grave. It was only because a rancher decided to drain a pond, only because a dragline operator pulled a bucket of mud, only because the water finally gave up what it had been holding, that the truth came out. Laura didn't know if that was justice, but it was something. It was an ending. And after 41 years of not knowing, an ending was more than she had ever expected. The Broken Spoke Ranch still operates. Ray Caldwell still runs cattle. The northwest section where the pond used to be is prime pasture now. Productive, profitable. But Ray doesn't go there often. He sends his hands to check the cattle. He avoids it when he can, because he knows what was there. He knows what his land held. And he knows that if his father hadn't dug that pond in 1978, Carl Draper would have found another place to hide Vincent Voss. Another hole, another grave. And maybe Voss would never have been found. But the pond was dug. The tractor was available. The water was deep. And for 41 years, a Massey Ferguson 240 sat at the bottom, holding a secret. The tractor didn't commit the crime. It was just the tool, the accomplice, the tomb. But it became part of the story, part of the evidence, part of the ending. And when they pulled it out of the mud, when the dragline lifted into the light and the chains came into view, it told a story that nobody had been able to tell for 4 decades. The story of a man who owed money, a man who killed over $5,000, a ranch hand who used a tractor as a hearse, and a pond that kept a secret until someone finally decided to look at the bottom. The Massey Ferguson 240 was scrapped. The chains were cataloged and stored in an evidence box in the sheriff's basement. Vincent Voss was buried. Carl Draper was named. And the Broken Spoke Ranch went back to raising cattle. But the story spread. Other ranchers heard about it. Other farms. People started looking at their old ponds differently, wondering what might be at the bottom, wondering what their land might be hiding. Most of them found nothing, but some of them started asking questions about tractors that had gone missing decades ago, about equipment that had been written off as stolen or lost, about the times when it was easier to bury a problem than to solve it. And they realized that the ground and the water and the machines that worked them kept records that people forgot or tried to forget. But the records stayed, waiting until someone drained the pond.